From Exodus 1:15-22. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, "When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw him into the Nile, but let every girl live."
No, that's good. Thank you. And thus begins the story of freedom for the people of Israel. Now, we know that story, I think. Who is the hero of that story? Anybody? Moses, or some might say God, but Moses, yes. Moses was there, yes, right? And so we usually, when we think of the Exodus story, we think about Moses, right? But there were so many other people involved. Many of them, we will never know their names. But the cool thing about this story in the Bible is that some of those folks are named. The midwives, who were not Jewish, by the way. They weren't even of the people of the Jews, right? They were just God-fearing people. We don't know what their God, the window to God they had found, but they were God-fearing people who had listened to God, and hearing God, they helped the people of Israel. And their names were Shiphrah and Puah. Let's say Shiphrah and Puah, right? And then there was Miriam. Miriam was Moses' sister. And how did she help? Well, when they put Moses in the Nile, she was working in the Pharaoh's place. And so she got the Pharaoh's wife to take this little baby and take care of it. I mean, that was a very wise, but kind of sneaky and undercover, right? So we remember Miriam, and we remember Moses' mother. Anybody know her name? Mrs. Moses. No. Jochebed, I think it is, if I'm not mistaken. And she, of course, had kind of, I think, fashioned all this. And so she got her daughter to convince the Pharaoh's wife to she needed somebody to take care of Moses. And guess who it was? It was her. She got a chance to do this, right? So all of those folks working underneath everything, right, to make freedom happen, right? It's a community. It's a group of people. I've been to a Seder meal. Any of you ever been to a Seder? Yeah, it's a very wonderful, holy event to go to. The first one I went to, there was a Jewish student who was at the University of South Dakota, and she invited me and our family to come to a Seder that she had at our church, actually. And she shared the Seder with us. And she told us, this is a liberation story, right? This is the liberation story of our people, the people of Israel. But she said, that's not what this meal is just about. This meal is to be a meal of liberation for the whole world. You are just not only to remember liberation for the Israel people, we should start remembering liberation for all people. And, she said, the responsibility for you at the day of Seder is to look inside yourself and to see where are you placed in the story of liberation. Where are you liberated Where has your family become liberated? Celebrate that past, but also where and how are you participating in the story of liberation now in your world? Where are you personally still enslaved? And how can you help God break you free? But also, where can you help others? So I got to thinking about this. If we were to have a Seder celebration, if you were, who would you invite to the Seder meal? What stories would you tell about your people's liberation? If you are here in the United States, you will know that without the African American people who were slaves in our country, we would not be where we were today. They helped us. They built a lot of the foundations of who we were as slaves. And we need to celebrate, not that they were slaves, but they were here in our presence. And we need to realize that they really were a Moses story, right? They were a people who were enslaved, who were liberated. Who would be the Moses of that story, would you say? Anybody? Got a couple Moses people? Who? Abraham Lincoln. It might have been more of a Shifram Puah. He wasn't of the same. But yes, I mean, yeah, Moses or Lincoln was certainly a part of that. Who else? Martin Luther King Jr., right? I mean, just huge. But he was really after, right? I mean, still part of the movement. Frederick Douglass. There's a woman. Harriet Tubman. Without Harriet Tubman, I don't think that thing would have happened. If you ever want to read a great book, there's one called Underground Railroad. It's a novel, but Harriet Tubman is one of the huge heroes in that. But the great part about that book is you get to learn about the different kind of folks who were involved in that Underground Railroad, in that process of helping people who were slaves escape and be free. And there are so many stories of that. When we were in South Carolina, Cindy and I went to South Carolina with Devin and Cassie. And when we were visiting there, it's such an interesting, Charleston is such an interesting city. It's got all that revolution history, the history of the Revolutionary War. It was kind of one of the main first settlements in our whole United States, but it was also the port in which most, 2/3 of those folks from Africa were enslaved and brought to that port there. And they were the first state to secede from the Union. But there are some wonderful stories of liberation that come from Charleston. There is a man named Robert Smalls. I would tell this story at my Seder if I was telling the story of this. Robert Smalls was a slave. And during the Civil War, he was made to be a part of the Confederate Army because he knew ships and knew how to handle that. And a lot of that war was fought out there in the sea. And so they put him in charge, or as one of the people, not quite in charge, of a boat. There were some white folks who were part of it too. And they left to go see their families and left him on the boat. And he decided that he was going to go and get his family and some other families, and he was going to take that boat. And the Union Navy was just in the port, just say about 10 minutes away. And so he decided he was going to take that boat and sail it through the Confederate side and head over and go to freedom by boat. And so he did this thing. So he flew the Confederate flag, went over with his ship to get his family and others, and they got on the ship. And then as soon as he got out of the gunfire range of the Confederate Army, he pulled down that flag because he would have been shot if he would have went any further by the Union Army. And he put up a great big white, just a bed sheet, and flew it, and he flew into freedom. And he became free, but he started right away to work for the Union Army, and fought the war, became a great war hero, and then later went back to South Carolina. I still can't believe this part of it, and became a U.S. representative. He got voted in, and he was a U.S. representative for 12 years, way back, way back, way back. What a hero, right? What a great symbol of freedom. Who's that person in your life, in your life story? Who would you lift up? Personally, a couple people I would invite to my Seder. One would be my mother, because I think she symbolizes for me the power of education to break the power of poverty and ignorance, I would say. My mother grew up in a family of 12 children out on a farm. Her dad, the first dad, committed suicide, and there were 8 children at that point. And so my grandma married his brother. That's biblical. Married his brother, and they had 4 more kids, but he was not healthy, and he ended up being in an insane facility for those who are struggling mentally. And so her mother raised all of those kids kind of by herself, 12 of them out on a farm. And not one of them made it past 8th grade until my mother, number 11. And the reason she made it was there was a teacher she had in her country school that thought she had gifts, that thought she probably could make it to high school. And so she had the guts to go to my grandma's house out on the farm and tell her. And my mother tells us to the day that her mother did not want her to go to school because she wanted to go out and work. She wanted her to get hired out so she could get some money from her. You know, she was supposed to go out, get hired out on the farm, get some money, and bring it back to the family. But this teacher came up to her and said, "No, Elsie really needs to go to school." And Mom remembers there were quite a few German words being spoken that shouldn't have been being spoken to anybody. There was just a lot of swearing going on in German by her mother. And finally the teacher said, "Mrs. Zanto, I do know how to speak German, you know." And so they talked and they talked and they talked, and still, her mother would not let her go. First day of school, that woman came out in her car to get my mother. My mother snuck out of that house, got into the car, and went to school. And later, she went to college. After that, she became a teacher. On it goes, right? So she became the first in her family to go to high school and then to college. And she broke that chain, right? That chain of ignorance, that chain of women are only supposed to do this. She became really a chain breaker. And so I'd invite my mother. And then I'd invite another woman that I love. Donna Meeker is her name. And she taught school at a Hutterite colony in the Dakotas. And it was back in the 60s and 70s where there wasn't a Hutterite woman or child that was even able to go to education past 8th grade. They just weren't allowed. And so this Donna Meeker was teaching there, and so she talked her husband Niall into one night. She said, "Niall, let's go for a drive." And they started driving, and they went down this country road about 4 or 5 miles out of town, right over by the colony. And she said, "Could you stop right here by this shelter belt?" So he stopped. It was dark, and he said, "What are we doing out here? What's going on?" And then she said, "Just wait, just wait." And they waited, and 3 girls, 8th grade, came out of the trees into their car, and they drove them to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, where she had a shelter set up. And 2 of them are now nurses, and the other is now a teacher. She helped liberate those 3 women. Again, Donna Meeker, right? Powerful presence, right? I mean, we'll never hear her story. We'll never hear it in the newspaper, but there she was, doing what God had asked, moving people from slavery, from being, brought down and held down to freedom. And I remember talking to Donna about this when she told me this story. I said, so why did you do that? And she said, Brooke, it's our story. This is who we are as Christians. Moses led those who were slaves into freedom. We're called to do the same. Harriet Tubman, she said, was a Methodist, Brooke. We've got to do the same. And she had that power. I was asked a couple of weeks ago at a book study I was in, just what is our hope as a people? What is our hope, Brooke? I mean, is it just to go to heaven? Is that what the hope is, that we just do all this so we can get to heaven? And it just kind of caught me by surprise. I didn't know what to say. What is our hope, right? And I thought to myself, this is our hope, that all people will be able to move from slavery, move from that point in their life where they're just controlled by someone or something else to a place where they can be ultimately free. That's who we are. We participate in that. I know I told you about a month ago about David Flameau. David was someone this church helped move from slavery to freedom. 22 years ago, I actually got a chance to interview him just recently on Zoom, and so I got to know him. But when he was 15 years old, he was forced to fight in a civil war in Liberia. He was only 15. They loved kids. They loved getting boys involved in those wars because they could control them. They were enthusiastic, and he said, I bought into it, I thought I was fighting for the right reasons. And he said, but he said about 6 months into it, he just said, it's like God just froze me in my tracks and almost just told me, get out of here. Like God was saying, run, David, run. This isn't where you need to be. This is not the life I have chosen for you. And so he ran. He ran all the way to Kenya from Liberia. He ran. He got there, and he got to Kenya. Who did he meet? But Robin Barr, a member of our church. Robin was working there in Kenya with I think it was a foster children's or adoption place. And he ran there, and he told her his story, and she got him connected to other people. And then about a year later, he called Robin up and he said, I'd really like to come to the United States to learn. I want to come here to come to college. And she talked to her pastor, who happened to be Roger Barr. Roger Barr used to be the pastor here. And Roger said, I think we can help. He said, I need a sponsor. I just need someone who will sponsor me. And so our church voted to sponsor David. And David came to the United States. And now he is a professor at the University of Regina, and he is a professor of justice ministries. And he's about a reconciling justice. He works for police officers, trying to teach them in the inner cities how not to be violent, how they can use their presence to bring about change in a different way. And another cool story about David is he said during the pandemic, his family has got 4 children, they're teenagers. We needed more space, and so we decided we were going to try to buy a house that was bigger. And he said, for the same price as our house, we were able to find a house with 7 bedrooms. And he said, wow, the Lord has really blessed us. And he said, but the Lord also told me that this can't just be a blessing. I need to give the blessing of these 7 bedrooms to the world. And so now every semester, he houses 3 or 4 international students that are fleeing from civil war in their country to come to that university. And he allows them to stay there until they get their feet on the ground. He's a part of the Underground Railroad, right? Of bringing people out there. So are we, right? Let's celebrate that. We are a part of that. And my challenge to all of us is, it's not just about sitting here, right? It's about participating wherever we are, however we are doing it, in that message that God is moving people from enslavement to freedom. And we participate in that, and we can, and we need to celebrate that. And all the people said, amen.